everyone, and welcome. Welcome to week 3 of organizational leadership and decision making. Jumping right in. This week, as with most weeks, we're going to start off by going over the assignments, and then we'll talk a little bit about the reading. Starting with the assignments. The two objectives of this week are that hopefully by the end of the week, you'll be able to evaluate how organizational performance impacts leadership behaviors. And secondly, how innovation in products and processes assist an organization with their internal innovation efforts. These ideas are fairly straightforward if you think about it, because what a leader is going to do will oftentimes depend upon what's going on within the organization during that period. So if things are going very well, they may have one set of behaviors. If things aren't going so well, they likely will have a different set of behaviors. Also, if the organization is being innovative in either how it's approaching problems through processes or what it's building and maybe even how it's building it, that also will impact the leader's behavior and also oftentimes is driven by the leader's behavior. During the discussion for week 3, you're asked to address kind of two prompts. And the way to do this is not necessarily to repeat those prompts in your response, but rather use them as something that drives your responses, your answers. And the first question is, do certain leadership behaviors improve and sustain performance at the individual, group, and organizational level? Basically, what that's asking you is, does leadership actually influence the performance of people, maybe the groups of people, or the entire organization? The second prompt is you're asked to provide your personal definition. These are your words of both process and product innovation. So what is the differences between those two? Using your own words, defining it as you would define it if someone were to ask you, not parroting some other answer, but rather think about it, read several definitions, and then perhaps pull together your own definition of what those words mean. So what does it mean to have a product innovation? What does it mean to have a process innovation? Week 4, as a foreshadowing of what is to come, is about the TAM methodology. By the end of the week, you should be able to define what that is and to gain a better understanding of how the role of technology leadership is transformed. For the week 4 written assignment, you're asked to read a journal article on how information and communication innovation drives change in educational settings. The key focus of the article was how technology-based leadership has driven the digital age, and that the role of technology leadership incorporates with the technology acceptance model, TAM. In this paper, address the following key concepts. You want to start by defining what TAM is and its components. Note how TAM is impacting the educational setting and give an overview. So those are the basic elements that you're being prompted to do. Make sure you do so in a scholarly fashion in 3 to 5 pages. That does not include the title or page or the references. And as always, make sure that you cite your sources, including 5 peer-reviewed journal articles, to ensure that you're meeting those requirements. As a reminder, this is the rubric that will be used whenever grading your paper. You want to focus on being over in this column over here, where you're striving for the highest points and the highest percentage of points available. So to do that, you need to start and make sure that you're covering off things like your introduction, make sure that you've got a very clear thesis statement and the subtopics are very clear. Also make sure that you include a mirroring conclusion. So that conclusion should be roughly the same sort of content phrased in a different way, showing that you demonstrated both you addressed the thesis statement that you said you were going to, and you did so by using some of the same, or using the same subtopics, which will likely be your headings in your paper, to address that topic. You want to make sure that you have reasonably clean grammar and spelling. Utilize Grammarly for such things. It is definitely a helpful tool. And you'll want to make sure that you're using APA style appropriately. So make sure that you have a title page that is an APA style title page, that it contains and it should be the professional template of APA 7th. So to be very specific, it needs to look a certain way. It should have a running head, just the running head, not the words running head, all uppercase, upper left-hand corner. It should have your name, or the first thing that should be on the paper is the title of the paper, and that paper title should not be that this is an assignment. It should tell us something about what the actual topic is. Followed by that, you should have the university that you're associated with, so your organization, and then your name. Those are what goes on the title page. Make sure that you're doing left justified. Don't full justify the paper. That's not an APA style. Make sure you put the citation on the first use of a source, not on the end of the paragraph. Many of the students have challenges of moving from MLA to APA. This is an APA university, and APA is far more than just doing the citations in parentheses. It is the entire format of the paper. So make sure that whenever you're doing your work, you review the associated rubric so that you're able to get full points. Moving on to the reading for this week. Again, out of organizational leadership, we're in part 1 still, contextualizing leadership, and we're into chapter 2 for this discussion, and that is strategic management and innovation and leadership. So at the end of this chapter, you should be able to explain the external internal context of work organizations and the potential implications for leader follower relationships and behaviors. You should be able to discuss the proposition that neoliberalism has shaped the role of leadership and analyze the factors driving innovation and the leader's role in facilitating the process. The purpose of this chapter is to do kind of 2 different things. The first thing is to take a look at leadership in general and looking at it kind of in a big picture sort of way. So looking at it at a macro versus micro level. The idea of a macro level is that it's going to be looking at things as they interact with each other at a more global level. So rather than within an organization, perhaps it's how that organization itself interacts with other things as well. And so part of that is to think about, as a leader that is doing things, they must do so within a certain world, a certain environment that exists. And that's one of the first things this chapter does, is kind of go over what leadership means inside of that context, and to take a look at it from that perspective, in addition to the perspective of the leader leading within an organization. Then the second sort of aim of the chapter is to talk a bit about how leadership dynamics has an impact on innovation. Innovation is an important part of most modern organizations, because without it, you're going to be solving today's problems with yesterday's technology or processes. So in order to do that, you need to do so you need to be continually improving your processes, and that it requires a certain sort of environment for people to be willing to do that and feel that they're empowered to do that. So moving to what is strategic management. So the kind of first word to look there is strategic, and that talks about strategy. That's a larger directive sort of thing versus more tactical management, which is kind of day to day. Strategic management is about long-term and strategy of interactions of things over time at a bigger sort of way. And in particular, strategic management is around dealing with kind of 3 major things. It's the independent poles is what this is calling it down here, and that's basically 3 different piers or pillars that are making up the whole thing. One of them is the values of the senior management. So what the senior management believes to be true, what they think should be done, and so on. The other is what resources they have at their disposal. And the last part of those 3 things is the environment in which they're having to function. Visually, you can look at it like this as a strategic, the poles being in the points within a triangle. If that helps you visualize it, it's a good thing. So the basic idea here is that there is a relationship between the values of the management and the leadership, the resources they have that they can actually do something, and the environment in which the organization itself exists. Environment changes dramatically, potentially, but it is at a snapshot in time, so a moment in time. And oftentimes the environment is one of the things that either encourages or limits innovation. Continuing that discussion about environment, that's where this whole macro concept goes on. It's outside of the organization itself, external to an organization. That means outside of the organization. So it's in things like an industry or an economy. It might even be within a field of technological sort of advancement. The micro level is specific environments within an organization. So the micro aspect of an environment is going to be the culture, the situation, the the company itself internally. Um, the external elements, the macro, is going to be impacting the micro environment. Companies can't exist in a vacuum, so to speak. They are perpetually being impacted by the world in which they exist. And so, to traditionally, the way that strategic management is being done is through a series of sort of steps that things do. You typically have some sort of a mission statement and you have some goals to help you reach that mission statement. So this sets at a high level what the organization believes that its purpose to exist is and kind of what things it wants to make happen. And then there's also this concept of taking a look at your environment and figuring out, well, um, what can we do? So at a macro level, the STEPL sort of approach, and then at a micro level, you may do something like the SWOT or Primo F. And then another sort of series of things you often do is come up with a strategic formulation. You take a look at the factors and choices to meet goals, and then you oftentimes talk about the implementation. So how do you actually make it happen? This is where leadership is going to come into play, and you're going to be doing some adaptation and development of strategy, and you're going to be talking about gaining support and commitment of those who are expected to carry it out. So as a leader, your job would be to encourage the people, literally to encourage them to help you meet your goals and the organizational's goals by helping them be aligned, first of all, so that they're all working together towards that common goal, but also making sure that they're motivated to do so in an emotional sort of way, because there's a lot of emotion that goes into people's productivity and their willingness to do what is necessary to reach a goal. And then there's the strategic evaluation, and this is basically an activity that determines whether the actual change and performance matches what has been planned and to what extent. So this is after the fact. You're taking a look and seeing, did we do what we thought we were going to do with the resources we put towards it, or did we do better or did we do worse? So this is sort of a assessment phase of the process. And adding more color to the previous conversation, whenever we're talking about strategic management, this is a process that only shows how strategic management should be done rather than describing what is actually done by senior managers. So this is about trying to talk about kind of what should be done, not what they might actually do. And strategy is a political process undertaken by people with power and who are influenced by ideology. So they have their belief system and they're in a position where they can actually do something with it. They have a position such that they can make things happen as they feel should happen, certainly by at least setting the strategy and the direction for the organization. As mentioned earlier, there are a couple of different frameworks that are used to evaluate environments, both micro and macro environments. The sociocultural, technical, economic, ecology, politics, legal, and ethical is often used to take a look at the whole entire macro, so the world within which an organization exists. And if you think about it, there is definitely a world economics, or certainly even within a country economics. You've got a technological assessment of the environment in which you're existing, some legal, ethical. The politics definitely makes a difference, and also what the culture, socio-cultural aspects of things, of what people's beliefs are at the moment as a whole, and so on. When you take a look internal to the organization at a micro level, we oftentimes have the two different approaches: the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. That's been around forever. And there's also people, resources, innovation, marketing, operations, and finance. So between those various frameworks, we're able to essentially assess the environment within that an organization is existing within. There's also typically hierarchies of things in the world. So within this context, we have things at a corporate level, a business level, a functional level, and then as a team level. This is assuming a certain type of organization within the business, potentially of more of a functionally oriented sort of organization, which is not unusual. There's also different levels of leadership, and there's organizational performance aspects to consider as well. So from a visual sort of perspective, here is a framework for linking management strategy and leadership. So the basic idea here, as you can see, this is certainly a hierarchical aspect over here. And then you've got different levels of leadership over here. And then this is where you're dealing with the environmental sort of both internal and external environmental elements. Shifting over to the nature of innovation. First, it's good to have a pretty good definition of things in general. So what is innovation? We kind of have our own intuitive sort of definitions, but this is a pretty good one. It's defined as the process of coming up with good and new ideas and making them work technically and commercially. So that implies that innovation therefore only counts as innovation if it produces something that ultimately can be sold to customers, or in the public sector, that will result in more for less. So it has to have, it's not just a good idea, it's a good idea that can be applied and used and can do something that reduces either the cost to produce something or is able to enable things to be served in a better way. Incremental innovation enables organization to do things better over time and in a cumulative form. So it's more little pieces at a time. Incremental innovations can produce significant changes, but it does so less revolutionary ways. It's kind of slowly getting better. It's each revision of something gets a little better. The end result of the whole thing may be something that is far, far better. Breakthrough innovations enable organizations to do things different. So doing things in a different way than it's previously been done. So some examples of some of these things, right? An example of an innovation going way back to Henry Ford with the assembly line. He came up with a process, a way coupled with some technological innovations that enabled him to do something in a better way, in a totally different way than had been done before. Whenever he's producing automobiles, he did so pieces at a time rather than building one car at a time, which is what had been done to a large extent previously. That same concept was basically adapted by McDonald's or the people that created McDonald's to to fast food. So rather than making a burger at a time, it was an assembly line process where things went through a process to create it. So somebody didn't sit and cook the meat and then take the meat from one place to another and so on. They cooked a bunch of meat. They sliced a bunch of vegetables and so on, so that it was very much about applying assembly line production to fast food. Incremental innovations are less exciting, but sometimes they can do things over time that becomes much better. Taking the automobile industry as an example, we've had consistent innovations in both manufacturing and the goods that have been manufactured. There was a time that having a car that got, say, 100,000 miles before it started having problems was unusual and highly desired, but didn't really happen. We have cars now that we expect to drive for 400, 500,000 miles before something significant occurs. So there's been definite advancement in the kind of the longevity of those devices. And I just talked about two of the different types of innovations. There's product innovations, which is something that perhaps is different than what has been previously done. And process innovation. So a product innovation is something that is totally new that maybe we haven't seen before. Personal assistants are something that didn't exist all that long ago. So your Google Home, your Alexas, your Siris are something that really didn't necessarily exist 5, 10 years ago. So that is something that is new and innovative, and it helps you do things better, and people in some form or fashion pay for them. So people are actually using that idea. Process innovations are how you do things, and maybe you do them in a different way. DevOps is a good example of a process innovation. Prior to DevOps, we had this tendency to try to build things in very big sort of chunks, and we would spend a lot of time going through figuring out, first of all, what we're going to build, or why we should build it, what we're going to build, how we're going to build it. Then we'd actually start to build the whole thing all at once, and it had some serious problems that led to the need to do things differently. So hence the process innovation. So disruptive innovation is a common pattern of innovation. Disruptive innovation is something that changes things. That's where the word disruption comes in. A company starts doing things in a different way, and everybody else in that industry or around them have to adapt and change to it the same way. Online um, e-commerce is a perfect example of a disruptive innovation. Companies that refuse to embrace online sales don't exist today. It's that simple. There are very few companies that exist that are only on ground brick and mortar companies. And even those that do exist have taken some of the concepts from e-commerce, such as a greater insight into analytics and so on, and applying it so that they can be competitive. So disruption is something that when somebody does it, it's not just that it's very different and whatever else, it's that everybody else has to adapt, hence the term disruption. When we talk about innovation, sometimes you'll hear terms about driving forces. That's another word for these sort of uh, uh, context sort of words, right? So this is about why does something happen or not happen in an innovative sort of way. So if you think about it at an external level, there's the things that might be making something to where innovation either happens or doesn't happen. Could be around how the global economy is working, what opportunity exists in the market. So if there's no market for something, then maybe there's not a reason to come up with something new. What kind of competitive pressures exist within the organization? So for example, today there's a lot of emphasis on organizations embracing artificial intelligence and machine learning as a means to deal with competitive pressures, doing things like identifying defects in the manufacturing process sooner than later so that they can lower the price point of the things that they're producing, and potentially even eliminating people in the process, and doing so with technology, which is oftentimes much cheaper. So rather than having a person visually inspecting something as it rolls down an assembly line, maybe they have something with a camera and some sort of telemetry sort of stuff doing that instead, and applying machine learning and artificial intelligence concepts that are able to do roughly the same thing as a person. Changes in laws and regulations are another thing that will either enable or disable innovation. For example, some of the privacy or regulatory laws might actually disable innovation because they make it harder to do things without potentially breaking the law or being in violation of some regulation. So definitely legislation or the absence of legislation can definitely have an impact on innovation. Changes in what technology probably is a really big driver or limiter of innovation. Oftentimes, your truly innovative things have taken something that is a relatively emerging technology and making it available in some other way, using it in some different way than what it may have even been originally intended. The personal computer industry is a perfect example of that. Prior to things like Apple and the IBM PC coming out, technology was very much computer technology is very much of a big organization thing because of the nature of the costs and so on. You had these people that were basically tinkerers, hobbyists playing with technology, and they figured out how to do so at a much lower price point because they were able to purchase chips at a very cheap place, relatively speaking. So the price point of the technology, the availability of the technology enabled the combination of things like a keyboard and a monitor and a microprocessor and some memory into a box at a relatively low price at the time. So technology definitely can drive what can be done. Another good example is drones flying today. That's made possible largely because of the advancements in artificial intelligence and machine learning control over the navigation of those devices. So having four motors running and controlling the speed of airflow in four different sort of ways and coordinating that to be able to control how it flies, and then adding to that the ability for it to fly itself, by balancing itself essentially on top of four different points is something that's relatively innovative and new. And that's enabled by the technology that supports it in several factors: lightweight batteries, high performance processors, and so on. So there are these factors that either enable or disable innovation. Within an organization itself, um, there are some things that make it happen or don't happen. They need to have knowledge oftentimes within an organization, what's known within the organization itself and what it knows about its external environment may very well drive or not drive innovation. Sometimes it's a combination of different sorts of backgrounds of knowledge that make it happen. And then having some sort of a positive innovation strategy. So encouraging it, viewing it as an effort as a potentially highly successful or perhaps failure. And failing fast is a perfect example of how you might do an innovative strategy of viewing it as an incubation phase, a think tank phase where you basically go off and take something and try to make it work and decide if you can and do an assessment rather rapidly. And then the last is this organizational culture and practice. Some organizations do things the way they've done them, and they are hesitant to embrace change and do things in a different way. Organizations that are structured that way and have that sort of culture aren't going to be as likely to innovate as those who think of things radically and are willing to try different things. A good example of an organization that is willing to try different stuff and has that sort of culture and practice is Google. Google will allow its employees to pitch various ideas and even competing products with at the same time to see which one turns out to be better. And then at the end of it, one of them goes away and one of them becomes successful and gets promoted to a true product out there. That sort of culture is a perfect example of how you do that. SpaceX did something very similar whenever they were building their early stages of their rockets. They would basically have competing facilities trying at the same time to do things in slightly different way and figuring out which ones worked better, which sort of process worked better. And eventually they settled on one, and it's working out pretty well for them. So this is a visual representation of one strategy for innovation. It starts with creative ideas, coming up with something that perhaps hasn't been done before, things that may or may not work out. And it's kind of shown here as a funnel. That's implying a certain amount of these things aren't going to work out. That's just the nature of innovation, is that some things work and some things don't. So of those things that do work, you select them and you start working on them to make them more of some sort of a product or some more accessible or usable fashion. Then once you've kind of got it to where you think you can actually do it, you really do it, you implement it. And then once you've built something, then you need to market it so that people will actually buy it. The whole point of innovation, as we talked about earlier, is not just coming up with something cool and kind of building it and there it is. It's getting people to adopt it and to use it and for it to bring value. And so in order for that to happen, oftentimes you have to market things. It's just the nature of the world. You have to tell people about it, or you have to have some self-marketing sort of strategy to where people tell other people. So word of mouth becomes your mechanism of marketing, or you use social media without necessarily doing proper marketing as we traditionally think of it. A good example of that is Tesla, who rarely ever pays for marketing dollars. They don't buy ads and whatever else, but they certainly produce what is essentially marketing materials. They just have other people that are very advocates of their technologies and their products that share them and market for them. And then the last SID is you need the culture and climate for supporting that innovation, and a strategy also is doing it. So these things working together help you to come up with an innovative process. So how does a leader's role sort of impact or fit into the innovation process? So one of the first things here is that you need different leaders to be able to work together in a shared leadership way. So they need to get along. They need to have a shared vision. They need to not be confrontational or anything else, but they also need to be more supportive of each other and complementary in nature so that they add to each other's leadership styles. And it's also sometimes the leader that got you to a certain stage isn't the one that takes you to the next stage. And that's why you might need a different type of leadership at different levels of the innovation process. So if you're early in the process, perhaps you need somebody that is leading a certain way. As something becomes more refined and moves along the process, maybe it's a slightly different sort of way that needs to be led. And part of that is, if say you're starting a an internet startup of some sort, and you're going to create an app or a website that does something during early stages of the development of that, you're willing to take huge risks because there's almost no, opportunity cost associated with those risks. So that means that you might have a leader who is very flamboyant, or maybe a leadership style that is very flamboyant, very risk taking, very aggressive, very challenging. And people might also be putting in tons of time, working lots of hours, and actually enjoying the whole experience because they're part of creating something. As you reach the stage where it becomes more of a product and less of an idea, you need to start thinking differently. And especially at the point that it starts being employed by people that are using it, you start taking less risks. You start doing things in a cautious way. So the leadership needs to shift from about encouraging true innovation and focusing more on potentially industrialization and creation and stabilization of the product. And there's obviously needs to be a balance between exploration, searching for new knowledge and ideas, and exploitation, which is using what you already know in a way that is to maximize the return on it. And you need to be able to be basically ambidextrous. So um, meaning that you switch between these two things seamlessly and at the time that's appropriate. And sometimes you'll do these both. Um, and it's necessary to be successful in the innovation process. This reminds me of a type of artificial intelligence that is adaptive learning, basically, where you do a mixture of exploration and exploitation in a balanced way, looking for a better way. At the same time, you're using what you already know. And so those two things together are quite powerful combination. The conclusion of this discussion is around neoliberalism and other sort of ideological sort of constructs. The basic idea is that belief systems here sometimes influence how people manage and lead. So the basic idea to take away here is that what companies do and what leaders do is often driven by what they believe and how they think. So if a particular individual feels that companies should be allowed to do what they want to do without a lot of government intervention and regulation, that's going to result in a certain set of outcomes. Conversely, if they believe that the government should set prices, protect the employees, protect the consumers, and so on, then it's a different set of things that will occur. So these ideas go throughout the whole process, including into business schools, um, through the media, and even in popular culture. So you have these idea that certain charismatic leaders are romanticized as innovative enablers, when in reality they're just charismatic leaders. So if you take an example, and this may offend some, but Apple is a perfect example. Steve Wozniak was the innovator. He created the vast majority of the computer, the architecture, a lot of the things that we take today. He created. He was the innovation expert. Steve Jobs was a charismatic leader. He enabled, in some extent, enabled Steve or Wozniak to do his work, but he did so sometimes in a controversial way. And at the point that he was initially removed from Apple, it was because he had led them down a different sort of path. And also, it was an example of the leadership style needed to change at the point that he was making some poor choices, such as unveiling or mentioning a forthcoming release of a computer at the launch of a previous version. So at the point that he announced essentially inappropriately the first Mac, sort of the Macintosh line of products being produced, he did so at the, I believe it was the Apple III, or one of the previous versions launches, which basically made no one want to go buy the thing that they were trying to launch, which had a devastating impact on the company. So the takeaway from all of this is to take a step back and to study it objectively. Don't believe the things that you've always heard. Apple didn't create the smartwatch. They didn't create the smartphone. They did make it much more accessible and they did market it very well. So it's about taking a step back. Where did the real innovations occur? And maybe some of the lessons learned is to marketing of something that has previously been created may actually be a very powerful thing. And with that, I will conclude this discussion. If you have any questions, do feel free to reach out to me. That's what I'm here for. Send an email, text, whatever it might be. I will get back to you as soon as I can. And I will be talking with you in the future.